In this lecture, we're going to begin our more systematic development of computer graphics. And I'm going to start by looking for a few minutes at a question of what is computer graphics. Since it's a pretty broad field, let's see how sort of where we want to place ourselves. And then what I'll do is develop a little bit of a model of a computer graphics system, and we'll build on that by going through the historical development of computer graphics. So as I said earlier, that computer graphics is, to me, a very broad field that deals with all aspects of creating images. So if you ask me for a definition, it's creating images with a computer, and that involves obviously the hardware, pretty obviously the software, and we also want to talk about enough of the applications that we understand where computer graphics is being used and where the demands for better hardware and better software come from. Now let's start with a very simple image. This is in your books. It was done by Hugh Walker at the Arts Lab for a dome project we were working on. It looks like a Christmas tree ornament, but it actually was a little sun object that we were putting in an animation. So we'd say, well, where did this image come from? What techniques did we use to produce it? And notice it has some very interesting features, that it has what appears to be this very modeled surface. It has lighting going on. Obviously it shows the curvature of being some sort of a sphere. It has this very interesting texture on it. So what hardware and software did we actually use to get this image? Well, the application, let's say here in this example, is creating this image. We used Maya, which is probably the most popular animation project software for modeling and rendering it. But Maya itself is built on top of WebGL, so it also introduces this idea that we have layers of software, one of which is the WebGL layer. It was produced on a PC with a pretty good graphics card, at least at that time. So, there's the hardware, there's the software, there's the applications. Now, let's look at a very simple graphics model of a total system. And in a way, it's like a typical computer system. It's got inputs, it's got outputs, and it's got some processing in the middle. But there's a little bit in there which is special to computer graphics. So let's look at the parts. First, on the input end, you're going to have more devices than you're probably familiar with. We have obviously a keyboard, so we can put textual kind of information in. We have a mouse, but we're going to do more with the mouse than just use it to click buttons. We're going to use it to point to things, and we're going to also have potentially other devices like data tablets and touchpads, and perhaps some three-dimensional input devices, even some more complex input devices they use in virtual reality. On the output, for now, we'll assume we just have some sort of a standard flat screen panel. Most output devices that you'll see can be modeled that way, and even when we talk a little bit about stereo devices, they'll be very, very similar. Now, in terms of the processing, there's going to be a central processing unit. We're going to work on a standard computer, PC or whatever, and it will have its own memory. Now, what's special to us is that the image is formed within some special memory called the frame buffer, which has a map of what we see here on the screen, pixel or by pixel. Pixel is just a picture element by picture element. So somewhere in this specialized memory, there's a value that corresponds to each place on the screen, and what we do is we form the image in that frame buffer. Now, what's really changed is this part here in the middle, that we're emphasizing that there's a special graphics processor called the GPU, graphics processing unit, that carries out the specialized graphics function, and it's, as we've said, incredibly fast and powerful, has a lot of parallelism in it, and that's where our shaders go. So if you're If we look ahead to the software or back to the simple example we did, the application is running in the processor, but the shaders are affecting what goes on in this graphics processor and controlling what happens there. And the graphics processor has its own memory. And in fact, one of the things we'll worry about is how do you best use the memory that's on the CPU, the memory that's on the GPU, and some additional memory which we will use to store textures in. But that's getting a little bit ahead. But basically, we have a graphics system is a computer system with a couple of specialized components in it and a little more variety on the input. Now let's returning back to the to how we created that image. What I'm going to do is give you a historical development to see how the process has gone, how we actually form that image. But I think it helps to understand how the hardware and the software have developed. Okay, so if we go back to the beginning of graphics, it really goes back to the 50s, although it was very simple then. Things like pen plotters were available then, and strip chart recorders. So all you really had was you had some sort of an analog digital converter that converted from what was in the computer out to some signals that controlled how the strip chart or the pen plotter worked. There were cathode ray tube displays, but they were pretty slow because the computers were slow. That something like your cell phone now is far more powerful than any computer then, and the computers that were available when people first got interested in computer graphics would take up a room, and they'd have thousands of vacuum tubes, and they'd cost millions of dollars. But the first display, let's focus on that for a minute, was the cathode ray tube, and just for historical reasons, because they're pretty much disappearing from the commodity market, is basically what you have, and you still have this in a lot of devices, is you have some sort of a phosphor surface, which when it's struck by electrons will emit light for a short period of time, and we control that by having some sort of electron gun which produces electrons. It's like a big vacuum tube, and we have some way of deflecting the beam by applying voltages to plates in the X and the Y direction. So we focus the beam. Our control of where the beam goes is by setting the voltages in the X and Y direction, and then we could move that beam around. Now, if we move it around randomly, like we generally was done in the first systems, that's called a random scan system, or a calligraphic system, because it's like drawing with calligraphy. The more recent versions, starting in the 70s, really where we started getting frame buffers, is that we scanned the frame buffer and went through it row by row at typically in the US about 60 times a second, and copied everything that was in the frame buffer. So the electron gun was sweeping across the phosphor 60 or so times a second, which was necessary because the phosphors emit light for a very short period of time, so they need to be re-energized or refreshed at those kinds of rates. Now, to get color, the standard system was a shadow mask CRT, and the idea was that you had a phosphor surface that had three types of phosphors. So if you excited a red phosphor with an electron beam, it would glow red, and likewise there were green and blue phosphors on there. And if you look at a CRT with a magnifying glass, you can see that, and how, so there were three electron guns, even though we call it the blue gun, the green gun, the red gun. They were just all shooting out electrons, and there was usually a foil plate with little holes that were arranged so that the blue gun could only energize blue phosphors, and likewise for the red and the green. So what you could do with that, so you had those things available back in the 50s when television was coming about, but they weren't particularly useful because the computer, for graphics, because the computer was just too expensive and too slow. In the 60s, things started changing a bit, and what we were able to do, because we only had those kinds of calligraphic displays or perhaps pen plotters was to draw line-oriented displays. So in terms of the example that I gave you, we could produce an image that looks something like this, where we would have the beam tracing out that, or a pen plotter tracing out that. There were a few other technologies that were somewhere a little better, didn't require the refresh. There was something Tektronix produced called a storage tube, which would retain the image for a while. But the real advances in graphics, because the 60s is sometimes referred to as the golden age of computer graphics, were two very important developments. On the hardware side, we started getting what are called display processors, which we'll talk about in a minute. And Ivan Sutherland did his project Sketchpad at MIT, which was really the major sort of conceptual advance in computer graphics. So let's talk about that for a minute. It was his PhD thesis at MIT. They had one of the first big machines, and they connected a CRT to it. But what Sutherland recognized was the power of being able to change that image in real time, so that you would see the image, you'd have some sort of simple device. He used a light pen, which was a device that could detect the light on the screen and then return a position for it. And then in response to where the light pen was, the computer would generate a new display, then the user would move the light pen around, and you had this interactive loop. And that's really still the basis of all user interface kinds of applications. And this created a whole new field when people recognized the potential of this kind of interaction. But it turned out that he also, because it was such a new field, had to actually create many of the algorithms we'll study later in the class for doing things like drawing lines and filling areas and deciding what would be visible on the screen. Now, the display processor was an attempt that originally came out of IBM to sort of unburden the computer, because the computer was such an expensive device. So the host was your big computer. It would produce graphics, and previously what would happen is that it would have to output to the CRT at this 60 frame a second to prevent it from flickering, and so that you could see. It was kind of an annoying display being refreshed. So instead, IBM built a special processor that had its own memory, which was called the display memory, or the display list. And what the host had to do was really just generate a file that went into that display memory that was just some very simple graphics information. Begin a line here, draw this line up until this new point, now draw another line, and just so the display processor, once it was loaded with this what was called a display list, would simply go through that list at the necessary frame rate to refresh that CRT, and the host could go back to doing other things. Now, one of the interesting things about this is there's a lot of interesting things. One was that at that time that cost about $100,000, which would be more like $1 million in today's money. But it really turns out is the model for what the GPU does, is that the idea of a GPU is that it does these specialized graphics tasks, and the CPU doesn't have to do that. It's just what has happened now is that the GPU has been reduced to a single chip instead of this $1 million kind of machine. But the concept is exactly the same. The display list has become the GPU memory. The display processor is the graphics processing unit. Well, let's jump ahead a little bit, because still at that time, basically all you could do were draw lines. So in the 70s, a couple of things happened. First, we started getting raster graphics, which is what we do now, and it was the beginning of graphics standards that you started getting some efforts, because people realized that graphics was going to be an important area, and there were a couple of efforts that were being made to develop standard software, the GKS effort in mostly in Europe, and the core standard in the US, which became part of the early Sun workstations, and also the availability of graphics, that we started getting the first workstations of the type we have now, and PCs that had graphics built into them. So everything would have could have a graphical interface. So let's look a little bit at that. So with raster graphics, basically the images is an array of picture elements, which typically now is at least 1280 by 1024 would be a fairly standard display. Then it was much lower, and these pixels lived in a frame buffer, and the frame buffer, as we said, was refreshed at whatever the rate necessary to get a smooth display. Here's just an image, and here's an area around. This is my cat, and here's a little area around his eye, and you can see the individual pixels here, and the resolution is high enough that when we see it, it looks like a smooth image. Now, what can you do with raster graphics? Well, what you can do that you couldn't do with calligraphic graphics and line drawing graphics was fill the inside of objects. So if we go back to our little sun object, you can now fill the areas inside of those little polygons. So basically all we had were polygons, and the way we got curved objects was to use a lot of polygons, but the polygons were pretty simple. They were filled with a solid color, and we couldn't have too many of them because the computers at that time were still fairly slow, so we would get this kind of a display which is closer to looking realistic. We can see the three-dimensional structure, but it's nowhere near what we would call a realistic image. A couple of comments about PCs and workstations is that historically they developed in different ways. The early workstations were always networked. They came out of, primarily the ones we're interested in were the kinds of workstations that came out of places like Xerox PARC, where not only was graphics and an interactive device like a mouse part of the basic workstation, but they were also networked together. So the client server model we'll be talking about a lot later started with those early workstations. PCs, now there's essentially no difference between a PC and a workstation, so we'll talk about computers to include both. But the early PCs, like the IBM PCs, were developed along a different path, and the important thing probably there historically was that the frame buffer was part of the standard memory of the computer. So for every pixel that was on the screen, there were a couple of bytes in memory that corresponded to it, which made it very easy for a user of an early PC, even though the display had a very low resolution. They were often something like 256 by 256 pixels, but you could write a very simple program in something like BASIC to simply alter the contents of that memory location and then be developing your own interactive or image display graphics. So that really led to standard users being able to do computer graphics. Now when we jump ahead to the 80s, we started getting much more realistic. So these are things we'll be studying when we get to Chapter 7 about discrete methods. But let me look at three things. These two are variants on the right, or variants of texture mapping. But on the left, we got to do what was called smooth shading. So instead of having polygons that were always filled with a solid color, we not only got to have more polygons, but we also got methods, algorithms that would allow us to alter the color or the shade inside of each polygon, and now we could create realistic looking lighting effects. So you can see here's the reflection of light on that thing. And this is still fairly simple, but it is much smoother and does look a lot more realistic. We also started developing techniques in the 80s for texture mapping. These techniques were known in the 70s, but we really didn't have the computation to support it, certainly in real time. Now it's part of every system. It's certainly going to be a lot of what we're going to do in WebGL. So here's two examples. In this example, what we've done is map the environment onto the surface to make it look highly reflective. So it's actually a two-pass technique where we form an image of the environment and then take that image and map it to the surface to shade the polygons in here, and we get that highly reflective effect. In the bump mapping on the right, notice how this surface actually looks modeled and how it's reflecting the light. This is a much more sophisticated technique, which in real time is only possible because we have GPUs that we can program with shaders, and this is one of the techniques we're going to study later in the class, which makes this surface look far more complex when in fact all the surface is the same surface here, and in fact that is even the same surface we had before with a very small number of polygons, but we use display techniques to render these in very complex ways, and that's a lot of what we're going to study. In terms of some of the other things that were going on then, we started getting the first special purpose graphics hardware. Silicon Graphics was the pioneer of this, in which they had VLSI implementations of what had become the standard graphics pipeline, the sequence of operations we do to convert from the specification of a polygon to perhaps a very complicated shaded image on the screen. They started realizing that in hardware through VLSI technology, which is now the model of what we do in everything we do, the kind of graphics chips that we have available. We started getting our first standards that were really useful. The standards that had been developed in the 70s were perhaps a little more academic than useful in the graphics community. And we started getting things like RenderMan from Pixar, which is still being used, and Figs, which is the model of a lot of things that we do now. We also started getting network graphics primarily through the X system, which you still use in Unix. And also the field of HCI, human computer interfaces, really started being recognized as a separate field, as not just sort of a sub area of computer graphics. Okay, so just sort of finish up the last sort of 20 years real quickly, is that in the 90s, OpenGL came about as a standard that was just at the right level, is probably the way to put it. It was close enough to the hardware to be efficient, but it had enough of an abstraction to be very easy to program, and it became a standard that's still probably the most important standard that's out there. Finally, what people had hoped for in computer animation came about, where not only could you do it at a reasonable cost, but you also had critically successful movies, and Toy Story was probably the most important of those, which really pushed Pixar up to the front. And we started getting, obviously, much better hardware. Like in everything else, we started texture mapping was supported in hardware. A lot of the digital operations like blending were now being supported, and also being supported in standard workstations, and we started getting more sophisticated buffers. I'd say that in 2000 to 2010, about to even till now, there was a lot of emphasis on photorealism. We got to the point where we could develop graphics that you could not tell what was real and what was computer generated. That was increasingly important in the movie industry. I don't think you'll ever see a movie which doesn't have part of it done in computer graphics, using computer graphics, but it's so photorealistic you don't even know that has taken place. So, for example, extras now and body doubles are all done with computer graphics rather than human beings. We started getting really powerful graphics cards for PCs. Part of the importance, and not only that, but the specialized ones that went into game boxes. The really important thing there was that because gaming started dominating the market, that rather than the scientific people dominating and deciding what the next generation of hardware and software would look like, it really started being focused on both gaming and at the higher end being generated by people who were interested in developing animations for things like movies. So you've got things like Maya and Lightwave. On the hardware side, the pipelines became programmable. This is where shaders first really became a standard way to control our graphics. They had been done earlier in software. Now because they were supported within programmable GPUs, we had much more powerful techniques available to us. One things on the hardware side, flat panel displays became the standard very quickly. There are various technologies around. There's LCDs, there's LEDs, there's plasma panels. But what they tend to have in common are two grids, and that by sending signals down the vertical grid and the horizontal grid, you can localize yourself to one point on some sort of a light emitting element, whether it's a LED or it's a plasma element. By putting the right voltages onto these grids, you can excite that element, and all the technologies sort of abstractly look like this. So finally, if we look at what's going on now, one of the things we conclude is that graphics is pretty ubiquitous. It's everywhere. You expect it to be in every application that you see. What you can do on your cell phone matches what you could have done on a $100,000 workstation a couple of years ago, and that's what sort of leads us to where we are now. That we have versions of OpenGL that run within the web. The web is certainly the dominant thing we see going on, so that's where we get WebGL out of OpenGL ES. And there's a lot of other things going on. The importance of stereo, we'll talk about how we generate stereo images a little bit later, and a little bit on things like virtual reality, alternate reality, enhanced reality kinds of things. But all of these are graphics that we can do now, and are certainly the most active areas that are going on both in practice and in research.